"He doesn't belong up here, back of the bus." Those words, harsh and dripping with disgust, cut through the chatter like a knife. I'll never forget how my stomach clenched when I heard them. It was just another Tuesday morning. The bus was crowded, the kind of packed where you're lucky to find a spot to stand, let alone sit. People shuffled on and off, and everyone seemed in a hurry, except for the older black man who got on a few stops before mine. He was slow, careful with each step, clutching his weathered cane with shaky hands. His clothes were tidy, but you could tell they had seen better days. The front seats, the ones designated for the elderly and disabled, were mostly empty. I thought for sure he'd sit there. He deserved toits the law, isn't it? But as soon as he lowered himself onto one of those seats, the driver barked at him. "Hey, move to the back," the driver said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The old man looked up, startled. He probably couldn't believe what he was hearing. Neither could I. I can't walk far," the old man said quietly, gesturing at his cane. The driver, a heavy-set middle-aged guy with a sour look, sneered. "If you want to ride my bus, you move to the back like everyone else." Nobody spoke. Everyone was looking, though some pretending not to, but they were. A lady next to me whispered to her friend, "What year is this?" Still, nobody moved. Nobody said a word to the driver. The old man's eyes darted around like he was hoping someone would step in. I wanted to. God, I wanted to say something, but I froze. The driver glared at him, tapping the wheel impatiently. Finally, the man nodded, gripping the pole for balance, as he slowly made his way down the narrow aisle. It was painful to watch. Every step looked like it cost him more energy than he had. The bus lurched forward before he even sat down, and he almost fell. A woman near him caught his arm just in time. I hated myself for staying silent. I hated everyone else for doing the same. But then karma hit. Just as the bus was turning onto a busy street, the driver leaned forward to grab his radio. Maybe he wasn't paying enough attention, who knows. The next second, there was this horrible scraping sound, metal on metal. The entire bus jolted, sending people stumbling. The driver had swiped a parked car, mangling its side mirror and scratching the doors. Everyone on the bus started murmuring. The driver cursed under his breath, slamming the brakes. He got out, yelling at someone on the street. It was a mess. Cars behind us were honking, and people in the bus were getting restless. The old man from his seat in the back chuckled quietly. Not loud enough for most people to hear, but I was sitting close. It wasn't a mean laugh, more like he was amused at the universe having its own justice. When the driver came back, his face was red. He was angry and embarrassed, barking orders for everyone to sit tight as he filled out paperwork. Some passengers were annoyed, saying the accident had nothing to do with us, but the driver snapped at anyone who dared to question him. His pride was clearly hurt. But the old man? He just sat there, calm as could be, like nothing had happened. Eventually, the bus got moving again. When the old man reached his stop, he stood slowly and shuffled toward the exit. As he passed by the driver, he stopped. For a second, I thought maybe he was going to yell at him or tell him off. Instead, he smiled, this small, tired smile, and said, "Good luck with the rest of your day." The driver didn't respond, just stared at him, lips pressed in a thin line. When the old man got off, the bus was quiet again. The tension lingered in the air. I got off at the next stop, feeling heavy with guilt for not saying something earlier. I've thought about that day so many times since. About how no one spoke up, myself included. About how easily some people use their power to put others down. And about how, sometimes, life has a way of humbling them in return. If I'm ever in a situation like that again, I'll speak up. I have to. Silence only helps the wrong side. And maybe, just maybe, that old man knew something the rest of us didn't. In the days after that, I couldn't shake what I saw. I'd catch myself staring out the window or zoning out, replaying it all in my mind, the crack in the old man's voice, the way the driver barked at him, and the silence that followed, the silence that included me. It's funny how moments like that can stick to your skin, even when you want to scrub them off. I told myself the usual excuses. I didn't want to make a scene. What if the driver kicked me off the bus? What if I just made things worse for the old man? But every excuse felt thinner than the last. The truth was, I froze because I was scared. scared to step out of the comfortable bubble where you can pretend you didn't see or hear something wrong. A few weeks later, I was back on that same bus route. Different driver this time, a younger woman who greeted people when they stepped on. It felt lighter. A better energy. I sat near the front, half hoping I'd see that old man again. Around the third stop, a familiar face came into view. It was him, the same man, cane in hand, shuffling up the steps. But something was different. This time, as he boarded, someone immediately moved out of their seat, gesturing for him to take it. He smiled politely, nodding as he settled in the front without hesitation. The driver, a young Latina woman, looked over her shoulder and said, "Take your time, sir. No barking orders, no sneers, no humiliation. Just basic human decency." I exhaled. It shouldn't have felt like a relief, it should be normal. But after what I witnessed before, it felt like justice, even if it was small. Still, I couldn't let that moment pass without doing something. So I stood, walked a few steps closer, and sat in the seat opposite him. "Hi," I said quietly, not wanting to draw too much attention. He glanced up from his hands, his dark eyes filled with the same quiet strength I remembered. "Hello," he said, his voice steady, but weary. I saw you a few weeks ago. On the bus, different driver." His expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. He nodded slowly. "Ah, I remember." I hesitated, swallowing down the lump in my throat. "I'm sorry for not saying anything back then. I should have stood up for you." He studied me for a moment, then let out a long sigh. "You're not the first to say that," he said, a little smile tugging at his lips. "You might not even be the last." That hit me harder than I expected. The way he said it, like he'd spent a lifetime carrying the burden of other people's silence, made my chest tighten. "But," he continued, "it's not about what you didn't do then, it's about what you'll do next time." His words hung in the air between us. I nodded, letting them settle into my mind, into my bones. We didn't talk much more, just small pleasantries before I got off at my stop. But as the bus pulled away, I felt different. It wasn't enough to just feel bad about what had happened. He was right. Next time I'd do better. And wouldn't you know it, next time came sooner than I thought. A month later, I was on a different bus. Same city, same bustle of people pushing their way through the day. A younger black man boarded, his arms full of grocery bags. He wasn't frail like the older man, but you could tell he was juggling more than just those bags. His shoulders sagged under some kind of invisible weight. The driver, another gruff, middle-aged guy, muttered something under his breath when the man accidentally dropped one of his bags in the aisle, spilling apples everywhere. "Hurry it up," the driver grumbled. This time, I didn't freeze. "It's not his fault," I said loudly enough for people to hear. My voice shook a little, but I kept going. "He's just trying to get his stuff together. Can you give him a minute?" The driver turned to glare at me, but to my surprise, another passenger chimed in. "Yeah, man, it's not that serious. Relax." Then another. "Why you gotta talk to people like that?" The driver's face turned red, and he muttered something about people needing to stay out of his business. But he didn't say anything else to the young man, who finished gathering his apples and took a seat near me. He nodded at me in thanks, a simple gesture, but it meant everything. After that, I thought of the old man again. I hoped, wherever he was, he'd know his quiet strength wasn't wasted. It had rippled out into something bigger, something that kept moving even after he stepped off the bus that day. And maybe, just maybe, it'll keep moving beyond me too. I'd like to tell you that standing up that day changed everything, that the city became more compassionate, that bus drivers magically stopped being jerks, that I became some fearless champion of justice. But life doesn't work like that. There have been other moments since then, moments where I didn't speak up, moments where I wondered if my voice even mattered. That's the worst feeling, honestly, the doubt. The little voice in your head asking, will this even make a difference? What if I just end up embarrassing myself? But you know what? That doubt gets quieter each time you decide to act anyway. Not long after the incident with the young man on the bus, I found myself in another uncomfortable situation. I was standing in line at a coffee shop, waiting to grab my morning latte. It was busy, the line stretching out the door, when an older white woman started loudly complaining about the barista, who happened to be black. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. "Do they not train people here? She's moving so slow. Why do they hire people who can't handle basic service jobs?" The girl behind the counter looked flustered, clearly doing her best to keep up. The woman just kept going, huffing and muttering under her breath. I looked around, hoping someone else would say something. The guy ahead of me stared at his phone. The couple in the corner exchanged a look but stayed quiet. I felt my pulse quicken. "Excuse me," I said, loud enough to cut through her complaints. "She's doing her job just fine. Maybe you should try being patient." The woman whipped her head toward me, her mouth hanging open. "Excuse me? You heard me," I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. "You're being rude for no reason. It's not her fault the line is long." People turned to look now. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement. The barista paused, glancing up from the register with wide eyes. The woman sputtered for a moment, then huffed dramatically and stormed out, muttering something about taking her business elsewhere. When it was my turn to order, the barista smiled at me, her voice soft. "Thanks for that," she said. I shrugged, feeling a little awkward. "You didn't deserve that." "No one does," she replied, and her words stayed with me. I've been thinking a lot about what courage actually means. It's not always big and dramatic like you see in movies or read in history books. Most of the time, it's quiet, it's messy and nerve-wracking. It doesn't feel noble in the moment, it feels risky, like putting yourself on the line for something small. But small moments add up. They ripple outward, connecting to other moments, other people, other stories. I still ride the bus almost every day. I see people lost in their own worlds, scrolling their phones, staring out the window, avoiding eye contact with strangers. But sometimes, I see something else. I see a passenger giving up their seat for an elderly person without being asked. I see someone helping a stranger pick up their dropped groceries. I see a driver taking the time to greet people warmly as they board. It's not enough, not yet. But it's a start. Every time I think of that old man, I feel like he's still teaching me something. About kindness, about resilience, about the power of speaking up, even when your voice shakes, and most of all, about how the smallest action, standing up for someone, calling out wrong when you see it, offering a little compassion, can be the beginning of something bigger than you, something that doesn't stop when the bus pulls away. The next time I saw the old man, it wasn't on the bus. I had stopped at a small park on my way home from work. It was one of those evenings when the air felt crisp, and the fading sun painted the clouds in warm colors. I sat on a bench, scrolling on my phone, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone sitting under a tree. It was him. He was leaning back against the trunk, his cane resting by his side. A small bag of breadcrumbs sat in his lap, and he tossed pieces to a few eager pigeons circling near his feet. He looked peaceful, like he'd carved out this moment for himself, away from the noise and the struggle. Before I could talk myself out of it, I got up and walked over. "Hey," I said, feeling a bit awkward. He looked up, squinting a little, but his face lit up with recognition. "Well, hello there," he said, smiling warmly. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," he said, patting the patch of grass beside him. I sat down, feeling the coolness of the earth beneath me. For a while, we didn't say anything. We just watched the birds, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant sound of children laughing on the playground. "I've been meaning to thank you," I finally said, breaking the silence. He glanced at me, curious. "For what?" "For what you said on the bus. About what matters isn't what I didn't do back then, but what I do next time. It stuck with me." He nodded slowly, tossing another crumb to the birds. "A lot of people get stuck on the guilt of what they didn't do, but guilt doesn't change anything. Actions do." I hesitated, then told him about the times I had spoken up since we met the young man on the bus, the barista, at the coffee shop. They weren't earth-shattering moments, but they felt like steps forward. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he turned to me with that same small, knowing smile. "You're finding your voice," he said. "That's good." "Trying to," I admitted. "But does it ever feel like it's not enough? Like no matter what you do, there's still so much wrong in the world?" His smile faded, and he looked out at the horizon, where the sky was turning from orange to deep purple. "Every day," he said, "when you've lived as long as I have, you've seen enough to fill a dozen lifetimes. There's been a lot of wrong, a lot of pain. But you know what else I've seen?" "What?" "People like you," he said simply. "People who learn, who change, who try. That's the only thing that's ever made a difference. Small acts, from enough people. Over time, that's how the world bends toward justice." I let his words settle in, the weight of them as steady as his voice. "Can I ask you something?" I said after a moment. "Sure. Back on the bus that day, why didn't you get angry? Why didn't you push back or fight him?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I spent decades fighting. I protested. I marched. I spoke out whenever I could. But that kind of fight? I've learned it doesn't always have to come with shouting or anger. Sometimes the strongest response is to keep your dignity intact, to stay calm in the face of hate. Let the world see which one of you looks smaller." His words hit me hard, and I realized something I hadn't before. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the way you stand tall, even when the world tries to shrink you. The old man sighed and slowly pushed himself up with his cane. "Well," he said, brushing the crumbs from his lap, "these birds have eaten enough of my bread for one day." I stood too, not quite ready to leave, but knowing the moment was coming to an end. "Will I see you again?" I asked. He smiled that familiar, tired smile. "Maybe," he said. "But even if you don't, you'll know what to do." I watched him walk away, his steps slow but steady, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared down the path. And he was right. I did know what to do. From that day forward, I stopped waiting for the right moment to speak up or act. Every interaction, no matter how small, became an opportunity, whether it was holding someone accountable, lending a hand, or even just giving someone the kindness they deserved. And each time, I thought of him. The man who reminded me that even the quietest strength can spark change. That standing up for someone isn't just about them, it's about all the people who will never see or hear about what you did, but who will feel its ripple effects all the same. That's how you make the world better. One moment, one action, one choice at a time.